Recording in progress.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to our event today called Global Power Shifts: How European Perceptions of China Are Shifting Between New Security Concerns and Strategic De-risking. So, while I see more participants are slowly coming in, I will slowly start already by presenting today's agenda. Giancarlo, can you move to our next slide where we have our agenda for today?
Yes, of course. Sorry. Going forward.
Okay, perfect. So we first of all have some short introduction remarks by myself about the event today, and then of course a presentation of our two distinct speakers who are already with us today. Then moving on, our speakers will present. And here, while we talk about European public opinion on China, we try to structure the discussion along time. So we will go through the three different phases. The first one showing European, basically a more consensus-based exchange with China. So that has mostly been in the early 2000s until 2015. And then moving on to phase number 2, we saw certain disruptions. So for instance, here I'm talking about COVID, about trade wars, and so on. So during that phase 2, we can see how Europe reassessed their engagement with China. And then finally, the phase number 3, what we call here polycentric global order. So this has mainly been since 2022. We see that European countries, or we basically see how perceptions towards China change currently that we have a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. Yes, so I'm very curious to see our speakers' opinions about European interaction with China along these three different phases. And finally, in the end, we will have a Q&A session where all of you are very encouraged to ask questions. And also, I want to make a remark. We try to make this session here as interactive as possible. So even during the discussion, if you have anything coming to your mind, any question, any remark, please just share it in the chat box. We have the chat box available here. And you can also always ask them directly by opening your camera, and you can use the raise hand function. So we will let you come in and ask your questions. So yes. So we're looking very much forward to have an interactive session. A short housekeeping rule also in the beginning. If possible, it would be great if you can turn on your cameras, because it's just nicer to discuss when you see who is in front of you. But also please note that we record this event, so in case you don't want your face to be seen for any privacy issues, then of course you can keep your camera turned off as well. Yes. In terms of moderation, we have today with us a team of 2. So is my colleague Giancarlo. Thanks, Giancarlo, from European Guanxi. He's the head of events. And myself, I'm the vice president of European Guanxi. And for the beginning, I will just shortly present who we are, so you know who actually organized this event. European Guanxi, we are a network of young professionals in Sino-EU relations. We have been founded in 2020, and we actually grew quite significantly since that. I think especially since we are a completely voluntary-based think tank, this is quite extraordinary, and I want to thank all of our members and everyone working on all our projects in the background just because of curiosity. Yeah. And what we do is we host expert panels, for instance, the one which we have today. And also we do have regular blog articles, we have a podcast, and since this year we have our regular newsletter. So please feel free to follow us on our social media and read our contributions. Okay, but I think this is enough self-promotion for now. You can move on to the next slide. Yes, so we can see our very great speakers, whom we are delighted to have with us today. We have with us Dr. Andrew Chubb, who is a senior lecturer in Chinese politics and international relations at Lancaster University. And he is also the director of the Lancaster University China Center, as well as a fellow at the Asia Society. And he is a leading expert on Chinese nationalism, where he focuses on how domestic narratives shape international behavior. I think it will be very interesting, especially for this event, to have your perspective as an outsider looking at how Europe interacts with China, and to give your thoughts on this topic. So thank you very much for being here today. And then secondly, we have with us Dr. Richard Turkjani. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Good. And yes, he is an assistant professor at Palacký University and also the program director of the Central European Institute of Asian Studies. And he as well, he's a leading expert in the topic on how evolving public opinion within Europe changes towards China. So I think it will be especially interesting to hear your perspective about, first of all, the overall approach, and then if we have time, maybe a more nuanced version, how different European countries or regions deal with China and how public opinion might differ across Europe. Yes, so very much interested in that. And this is it from my side so far. Today, my colleague Giancarlo, he will lead the moderation round. So thank you so much, and we can move forward to the next slide.
All right, thank you so much, Hannah, and I'm very happy to be also here with all of you, and thank you so much for all of you participating today. So as already mentioned before, we have overall 3 subtopics which we would like to deep dive into. They are historically based. We are attempting to reconstruct a little bit the stories on how the perception of China have evolved from a mere economic partner to a more systemic rival. And obviously, having Richard and Andrew with us today helps us a lot to contextualize this in different phases. So the idea is just to have a very straightforward conversation. I will be here giving some first contextualizing questions, and hopefully we can make a very productive conversation out of this. Please don't hesitate to give your own thoughts about this, and we will ideally shift between each phase in every 10 or so minutes, but obviously this is going to be depending on how fruitful our conversation is at the moment. So without further ado, maybe I would propose to start with this first phase that we have, which is what we entitle as Europe consensus-driven engagement with China. And why we have framed it this way is because we believe that there's, according to our studies and how we perceived your way of framing the narratives, China was not seen the same way that it's seen today. We were much more driven towards a cooperative cooperation with China on an economic terms of view, and there was no idea of China as a potential rival in many different sectors of security today. So maybe as a first introductory question, I would like to maybe invite Richard to help us contextualize a little bit the situation. And maybe would it be possible for you to give us an idea of how Europe's approach to China was before 2015, and would you really describe that there was this kind of predominance of economic narratives going over the idea of security concerns at the time? Obviously, I leave the space onto you.
Yeah, hi guys, hi everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's good to see you guys just a few days before Christmas. Yeah, I would agree with what you're suggesting also in the question. You know, you talk about the economic optimism in Europe kind of earlier. I guess when we talk about like how, you know, the European approaches of EU approaches towards China, it's always good to look at, you know, or mention clearly if we talk about the official policy or if we talk about public opinion. So obviously, as also Andrew and me, we are focusing quite a bit on the public opinion, but in a way, public opinion also mirrors some kind of broader sentiments. So it's not a coincidence that a lot of public opinion surveys are called barometers. So they kind of tell us, you know, what's the vibe around. But I would say that you know, European perceptions of China, public perceptions of China, have always been quite negative, and this negativity was primarily driven by politics. So most Europeans, when they think about China, they think about China as a communist country which has a lot of human rights issues, maybe a country which they don't like geopolitically, their position on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, South China Sea, and so on. Now I'm kind of referring to what are the driving forces of European public opinion, right? Not necessarily, what I would suggest, but this is also what we see from the research. So that's the first thing, that European public has always been focused quite a bit on the politics. Having said that, much of European foreign policy towards China was indeed driven by this economic, what I would call that, China was seen as an economic opportunity. You mentioned the word as collaboration. And yeah, we often use this word, but really what we talk about was that European businesses just saw China as a place to invest, place to export, or place, of course, to outsource their production because that was cheaper and so on. And so generally, China was a place to make money, to improve the business. I would say that has changed, and I think we'll get to that. And I guess what I would say is, first of all, Belt and Road Initiative was an interesting period because also the American maybe approaches and perceptions and policies towards China were changing at the time. But in my previous research, I found that actually Belt and Road Initiative, at least for a few years, maybe 2013 to 2015 to 17, it did implement a little bit of this economic opportunity optimism into European discussion. Because generally what we see in Europe is that if there is discussion about, or in the past, if there was discussion about China which was economic, that discussion tended to be somewhat more positive. If the discussion was dominated by political themes, that was always negative. And so, coming to, and Belt and Road Initiative somehow underlined those economic terms at the beginning, because somehow this was seen as maybe Europe can profit from that. Those kind of images started to change around 2017. And really what we see in the post-2017 or so is that political themes remained negative, but now China is not seen as an economic opportunity. And so even economically, the discussion turned more negative. And so those things put together kind of lead us also to the fact that overall European official policy towards China turned more, as you mentioned, that China is now seen more as a rival, not only politically, but also economically, geo-economically, and so on.
Okay, I see. So the idea is that it was already predominantly negative from the start. We have this kind of lapses where economic opportunity comes in and gives a more brighter opportunity to see this collaboration going forward, and then it's more of a return to maybe more traditional points of view. Maybe I would like to take this opportunity to invite Andrew to maybe comment this and give your own opportunity to give this kind of interpretation. So would you also say that in that case, the policy debates about security around China were always present, or it was just some kind of temporary shift, this kind of economic optimism?
Thanks, Giancarlo and Hannah and everyone else at the European Guosi team for putting this great event together. Really great to be with you and to be talking with someone I consider to be truly one of the leading experts on Europe-China relations, Richard, here. So I'm very pleased to be able to give a kind of outsider's perspective here, but I offer it purely in the spirit of humility as an Australian based in the UK, which is now outside of the EU. So a lot of the observations that Richard has already made, I fully agree with, of course. One thing I want to pick up on and maybe build out a little bit more is this idea of consensus-driven engagement and economic engagement in particular, because I do agree with the premise of that question that economic engagement was fundamentally a driver of Europe's approach to China during this kind of 2000s to the mid 2010s period. But I think there's a broader context to this. I think it was actually a consensus across the kind of the Western world, and maybe even extending beyond the Western world to other kind of capitalist democracies, Japan, South Korea, even Taiwan up until 2016 as well. So this idea of China as an economic opportunity and that's the fundamental nature of relations with China, is not something that's particular to Europe's approach to China. It's something that's actually shared across the Western world and beyond. I think that's important because it's a kind of a global perception, and there's a reason why it's a global perception, which was that at the time, given the power differential between the United States and China in particular, and in the first half of the 2000s particularly, China's one way it's been described is a charm offensive, kind of focusing on soft power and building attraction rather than attempting to throw its weight around. Although it was growing economically and it was building a navy and it was in the process of building maritime law enforcement forces that would, become basically the point of the spear as far as regional tensions in East Asia were concerned. All of that sort of became apparent over a fairly long period of time. It took some time for that type of perception to start to predominate and be recognized, particularly in faraway places in Europe, as well as in actually places around the region that were sort of directly subject to these kinds of advancements of China's material power. So that's one thing, is that kind of economic first approach to China was a global phenomenon, broadly speaking. And then on the point of public opinion, which I do think is very important to kind of keep in view here. I think I agree with Richard that it's been very negative for a long time in Europe, in particular. I run a project with the Asia Society. You mentioned I'm a fellow there. The main thing that I work on with the Asia Society is a project called Global Public Opinion on China. And that's a project aggregating, bringing together as many survey results about China as we can back to 2000 and before. And what the European results in particular show is that public opinion towards China in the very early 2000s, there is a period where it does actually lean slightly positive. But things start to go downhill in terms of public perceptions of China well before the sort of elite policy starts to change. In fact, I would say if I could share my screen with you, I'd be able to show you the chart that actually shows this. It sort of changes about 10 years before the policy towards China starts to move towards a more security-oriented and threat mitigation oriented framing of what China means for Europe. And I think that relates to a few different things that have kind of long faded into a lot of our memories. One of them in particular has been the Beijing Olympics. So the Beijing Olympics were a major kind of celebration for China about its sort of arrival and its newfound power on the international stage. And this was in many parts of the world viewed as, a fairly unambiguously positive phenomenon. However, in parts of the world that had a particular emphasis on human rights and where there were significant overseas diaspora communities among sort of persecuted minorities from within the borders of the PRC, particularly the Tibetans in the 2000s, and then later the Uyghur community, who was subject to extreme repression in the 2010s and onwards. The actual occasion of the Beijing Olympics, sort of celebrating China's rise to power on the world stage, was also an occasion to draw attention to the kind of downsides and the human rights implications of the PRC's newfound power. And I think that actually that basically made the Beijing Olympics a matter of major controversy in many Western capitals, particularly in Europe. Think back to the protests in Paris, protests across Europe as the Olympic torch relay went around, also in the UK as well. So this negative trend in public opinion, actually, as Richard mentioned, it's not only been negative in a kind of aggregate level. This is what our data at Global Public Opinion seem to indicate. Not only negative in an aggregate level, but it's actually been trending negative for a prolonged period of time. And there's an argument to be made that eventually politicians start to feel that pressure once the economic benefits of an economics first agenda in dealing with China don't materialize. It sort of manifests a very, very clear kind of incentive to take seriously the kinds of threats that China can pose from a political perspective.
Okay. I thank you very much. I think it's a very clear perspective, and I do foresee, at least I'm very curious about how indeed Europe was always a bit traditionally against the view of China in a negative way. I think yes, maybe some of us might be we're very interested on our side about China, and obviously we might not be the most representative factors of the population in Europe. But I do agree that perception in European countries have always been rather reserved or conservative. Maybe what I would like to maybe ask as a concluding questions for this first sub part is to maybe analyze a little bit the situation. As you agreed, maybe there's most parts in the world had this kind of optimistic lapsus over China for a certain period of time, but there was always a bit of a degree of skepticism regarding these kind of human rights issues. Would you say that maybe places like Europe had a different way to deal with these kind of controversies compared to maybe other parts like, I don't know, the United States or the Australia? Was there a specific way for European countries to deal with this kind of inconsistencies, maybe, would you suggest? Or was there a unified stance against this kind of subtopics or problems? It's a joint question. It can be answered by either one of you.
Yeah, maybe I will just repeat what Andrew already said. I don't think that Europe is that specific compared to many other places. In a way, there is a difference in the world how China is viewed, but that difference is mainly between what we would call global north and global south. But Europe is not the only part of the world which counts as global north often, right? So Andrew, I mean, Australia, US, Canada, but also countries like Japan, South Korea. In a way, I would say that the European perception of China is very similar to these places. Yeah, so I think I would mention it. Then there would be a big difference between these places, which tend to be liberal democracies, and these places would tend to, the people in these places would tend to highlight politics and the fact that China has a very different political system, and that would be in the forefront of their image of China. They would recognize that, yes, we trade with China because that, is beneficial. And in a way, that fact that it was beneficial was what was driving, many of these countries' foreign policy towards China. Right, but still, there was always the recognition that China is politically very different animal, and but those political themes were and still are not that present for the countries in the global south. Now, again, if you ask many people, and we did ask, what is their perspective of Chinese politics, many of these people will have negative view of Chinese politics, but that's not the first thing which they would think about China. The first thing they would think about China would be more of an economic. So in a way, you see this, this kind of, in a way, struggle between the political and economic themes, when in the global north, the political themes tended to be primary and still are, and economic secondary, and in the global south, vice versa. But what is interesting now is also, and I think this wasn't changed yet. Andrew mentioned the kind of that dynamics, but I would say that what is driving a lot of these changes that now we don't see China as economic opportunity anymore is that China changed, right? China today economically has a very different relationship with Europe, with Japan, with many countries around the world. And so that fundamentally changes that economic logic. And for many countries, China now is not economic opportunity, it's economic competitor, or economic threat. So I guess maybe we'll talk more about that down the line. So in terms of public opinion, I mean, for us as scholars of public opinion, and maybe the question to what extent public opinion influences the official foreign policy or vice versa, you could say what Andrew mentioned, that the foreign policy of countries in a way followed public opinion. That's one perspective. But you could also say that in a way public opinion was negative and is negative, so not much change in public opinion. What changed is that economic logic, and that economic logic really drove the change.
Okay, I completely understand on this kind of perspective. And Andrew, do you have anything else to add, or we can proceed to our next phase of the conversation?
No, I completely agree. I think one way of thinking about it is that public opinion creates certain pressures, and what we've seen in the period that we're discussing here, from the 2000 to the early 2010s, is public opinion being overridden by economic concerns and by positive economic opportunities. But when you remove that from the equation, then that creates the conditions for the underlying politics to start to make their influence felt.
All right. Okay. Very clear. I think we can understand that it's more or less the same tendency that was just maybe lightened up with a part of economic opportunity during this kind of period of time. Maybe with that kind of understanding going forward, I suggest we would go to the topic number 2, which is more what we are trying to analyze throughout this discussion, and where maybe we can start seeing a bit the different facets of this kind of tilting of public perceptions, at least in a more geopolitical way rather than an economic opportunity kind of way. So maybe I could actually state all of the potential externalities that have happened until now. I think we are all we can all acknowledge that there have been a lot of things that have changed this kind of situation. We have COVID, we have the start of the Trump administration and tariffs ongoing, and maybe other more geopolitical sectors like the war on Ukraine that also showed different facets of China and how they have been supporting Russia in this kind of case. But maybe the question that would come to mind is, all of them might have had their role in influencing public opinion in Europe, but is there one of these facets that has been more predominant in this kind of role in changing these ideas? I don't know, I could either propose this question to either you, Andrew, or Richard, whoever feels that it has more ability to give an answer. It's more than welcome.
You shouldn't say who has more ability, because then, anyway, both of us could answer that. Andrew, do you want to go first? I started the first two questions. You go ahead now.
Sure, with the caveat that I actually think I have less ability to answer this question in a general way. I do have one perspective on this question, which again comes from that very data-focused project that I mentioned before, and which I put in the chat, Global Public Opinion on China. And here again, we can look to the chart on Europe, and what that suggests, although I stress here that we're talking about correlation rather than causation here, but what you can see is that amidst the general downward trend from the early 2000s through to where we are now, and I'm not sure, can I share my screen, Giancarlo, or is that restricted to the hosts?
No, I think it should be possible to share. Maybe I just need to.
I've just sent a request, so let's see if I can make that happen. If not, I can just describe it.
I mean, if we can do it, we are more than happy to share. I just haven't received this request. Did any of you receive it, Daria, Hannah?
Yeah, I think
I
the
did.
functionality has become available, right? So
Yes, I made
so
you
maybe you can
co-host.
see my window now. And this is our
Yes, we do.
accumulated, yeah, so this is a plot of our accumulated several hundred surveys taken within European countries regarding just general favorability towards China. And I'm going to stress actually huge credit to Richard here for the Sinophone Borderlands project, which has contributed more than its fair share of these results, these many hundreds of results. Each of these little spots is a data point. That's an individual survey that's been taken in one or another European country since 2000. And Richard has been absolutely the leading light in organizing this survey project through Sinophone Borderlands. This particular chart plots the Sinophone Borderlands results since 2020, together with Pew and YouGov and Eurobarometer and all the rest of the big sort of polling services that have taken polls in Europe. And so what it seems to show, just kind of cutting to the chase, is that the decline, the most recent plunge in European views of China really starts from clearly before COVID. You can see here, my Zoom window is kind of covering up the numbers actually, but you can see here, 2018. So on average, across all the polls taken across Europe, it's -6. So as Richard said, it's already negative. 2019, it's by 2019, it's on average, it's -16, and then 2020, it's -20, and then it's stayed very, very low. The point being that the recent plunge actually started from 2018, and I mentioned correlation rather than causation as the basis for my answer, and the correlation that I see here is really the sort of scandalous and extreme repression of throwing many hundreds of thousands, potentially over 1 million of the Uyghur population and other minoritized members of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang region of China into re-education camps, which at this time, again, this COVID can't explain the timing of this plunge in European perceptions of China. And I'd be very interested to hear Richard's perspective on the other alternative explanations for what happened in 2018, 2019 that could potentially also explain or contribute to explaining the timing of this plunge in European perceptions of China. But it seems to me that this is precisely the time when the issue of China's kind of radical turn against human rights within China's borders really starts to take effect in European consciousness in terms of media coverage and in terms of popular knowledge of what was going on within China's borders. What do you think, Richard?
Yeah, and thanks a lot, Andrew, for mentioning our project, to which of course you contributed as well. And that's good you mentioned it, because unlike what you did here, so you kind of looked at the long time trend. So what we did was we did our surveys in 2020, and then 2022, and then 2025. So we don't have such a long trend, but in a way, based on those in-depth surveys, we can basically produce the answers. And so in a way, 2020 and 2022 are the years which, as you referred to, those were the years where the European perceptions were already very bad. And in fact, they were so bad, I would say sometimes, that actually COVID couldn't really make them much worse because they were already very bad. You could see that, for instance, when you look at the image of Russia, like it really took Russian invasion, the full-fledged war, for the image of Russia to become even more negative. So yes, if China invades Taiwan, the Chinese image would become more negative. But the COVID was only just for many people was just another thing which was in the line of those things which were going on. And I agree with Andrew that Xinjiang, Hong Kong was was something which was very visible, especially, for instance, in the Baltic countries, in Central Eastern Europe. Maybe we'll talk about that later on. These parts of Europe tend to look at China through the ideological lenses, perhaps more than the Western European, because they look at China through their own historical memory of communism and so on. But one thing which wasn't mentioned yet, and I would actually say that's one of the main driving forces, and maybe even the bigger one, is the Chinese diplomacy. The 2017-18, if you recall, was the time of the wolf warrior. I also published a paper where we looked at different EU countries and we actually compared them between themselves. And in our first survey in 2020, the most negative country was Sweden. And you may recall that Sweden was also the country which kind of received the harshest treatment of the Chinese diplomacy. So if I should pinpoint one thing, what really contributed to the worsening of the image of China in Europe, I would say that was wolf warrior approach. And that actually was different across the country. So, for instance, France had quite a few instances. Czech Republic, as we said, Sweden, later on Lithuania. We didn't do survey in Lithuania, but that would be another case. And that in turn, that Chinese diplomatic shift was driven by, I would say, the new confidence of China, right? The Trump was elected for the first time, Brexit happened, the West seemed to be falling apart. And then when the COVID came, of course, the Chinese leaders, after initial few months, felt that they're doing a very good job, especially compared to many Western countries. Again, we don't judge what was the reality, but I say that the Chinese leaders became more confident. And so this confidence was driving this very undiplomatical diplomacy, so to say.
Okay, I completely understand your point of view. So maybe as a rebuttal question, if I hope you can actually answer it a bit quickly, just so that we can transition to the next part, is it that I have this impression that most of the things that have mostly affected the opinion on China are more linked to geopolitical values and communication tactics that have become much more assertive in the recent years, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe a question that I would be very curious to know is there any correlation at all with maybe the fact that of economic frustration? China also might have always been very unequal in the way that it lets European countries do trade with them. There's shifting trade balance that was always in Chinese favor, the rising fear of fiscal dumping, the arrival of Trump at the White House that might have sparked all of these factors. Does any of these factors for you account for any kind of marginal impact on this kind of changing behavior, or it's really mostly just about political choices in communication?
Yeah, I can quickly jump on that because I think one of my papers talk about something like this. The short answer would be maybe surprisingly, but it seems to me that people don't have maybe such great ability to identify the China's economic impact, or at least that's what it seems to me often. So one paper in which we published recently with some colleagues looked at the economic dependency of China, and basically we found that people make their decisions based on the perceptions, not based on the reality. And there is sometimes the difference between how much your country really economically depends on China and how much you think it depends on China. So I would say that I think that those instances, for instance, the Chinese ambassador in Sweden made a note that that if Sweden acts badly, China will use guns. These kind of comments are just so easy for people to understand from the headlines that I would say for a faraway country, this is stronger impact on their image of China than something what I agree with you, but something 10 years ago, the discussion that maybe we lost the factory because that factory was outsourced to China, that was a little more abstract at the time. I think now the situation in Europe may be changing with the electric vehicles being very much present. I think now there is really this economic pressure, which is perceived more than it was 10 years ago. Because then again, I would agree that in many other places, I don't know, for instance, I did a research in Ghana, and over there, people who have direct economic impact, they can tell you, I am a fisherman and I do business with the Chinese fishermen, I benefit or I lose my job. So people can tell that. But for most people in most places around the world, they don't have this direct impact. So once they have it, yes, the direct impact play a role. But if they don't have it, then those political headlines are more important. At least that's what the findings seem to suggest to me.
Okay, I perfectly understood. Obviously, Andrew, if you have additional information.
Yeah. So in the spirit of, forming a bit of a debate, I might suggest maybe I don't disagree with Richard that certainly at the popular level, the perceptions of China's economic role tend to be very often, China's economic role can be very abstract for a lot of people, unless they're directly involved in sort of China-related industries. But if we flip it over to the elite level and the European policymakers, I think we can see quite clearly by, again, pre-COVID, 2019, EU-China Strategic Outlook, I think it was April of 2019, that document that came out and defined China as a sort of cooperation partner, primarily on sort of climate change mitigation and environmental issues and global challenges, economic competitor, and systemic rival. Systemic rival often, primarily, I think, referring to, correct me if I'm wrong, of course. Again, I hasten to add I'm the outsider here, but systemic rival referring to those kind of political and value-based concerns, but the important one being economic competitor in the middle there. And I think this indicated already at the level, at least, of the European Commission, that China had been recognized the economic benefits that may accrue on various balance sheets were starting to be offset and even outweighed by economic downsides of the kind that maybe aren't perceived at the popular level, but were starting to be picked up already by the end of the 2000s by European policymakers, specifically in the European Commission.
Okay. I can see the overall tendency, and I think there's a lot that we could still further share about it. But I think what we could suggest is that we can see overall your perceptions and move towards the first part of this discussion, which would be more to assess what is the situation now, basically. Like, you already a bit pre-introduced this in your last answer, but maybe what would be interesting in this part is to assert maybe in the next 5 to 6 minutes, so we can have some time for Q&A, how likely the notion of de-risking that has been developing in the latest years in Europe has been entering this kind of new conversation. Like, now we have been hearing more and more this idea that Europe needs to be asserting its own security, its own perception of the world, and keep a little bit its own political agenda, at least partially independent from its traditional allies like the United States. Maybe what I would like to suggest is, do you have a perception that Europe is developing this kind of unified perception or stance, or there's some kind of disunity depending on the country that we're looking at? I mean, I'm giving some very generic presumptions. I don't know. I myself come from a country like Italy, which has traditionally been more positively headed towards China, maybe there's much more divide with European countries in the north. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on this? Richard, maybe, or...
Ooh, thanks. Here I was hoping maybe Andrew could start, because this is a very tough question, but as an EU citizen, so Andrew can pretend he's not now, so I would have to tackle this one. Yeah, I think in a way this question and this topic is very broad. So let's have a discussion here and share our opinions. We're really at the major crossroad now for the EU foreign policy, for the EU role in the world, and of course for Europe, China, Europe, US, Russia relations, and so on. So, and as we speak now, the EU. I mean, we have of course the talks about the Russia-Ukraine war. A lot will depend on whether any settlement will be made there, what kind of settlement, and so on. So I mean, this is a major crossroad. I think we cannot exaggerate how much of a crossroad we are now, and then in a way the future trajectory will depend quite a bit on how we are moving from now. Of course, that will also depend on the political choices of the US, right? What's happening there? Because you refer to kind of the transatlantic relationship, but what's happening in transatlantic relationship is not that much under control of the EU at the moment, at least, right? And so in a way, the EU just has to find its approach in the reality it is given. And obviously, especially, I guess in the short-term future, the question for the EU is, whether the EU will be able to put its act together. And if it does, then in the medium-term future, we could say that, okay, now the EU can force perhaps other great powers into, listening to it. At the moment, the EU seems to have lost a lot of its leverage. Even there have been studies about, the Europe-China relationship, right? 10, 15 years ago, Europe was clearly on top of technological competition. Right now, we are equal, or China is ahead in many cases, right? And so how Europe-China relations is going to look in future depend whether European attempt to increase its competitiveness, reform its defense sector, build up its also military. Basically, if the EU will be able to act as a great power. And that obviously depends a lot on a lot of election results across Europe, right? So one option is that the Europe would not be able to come together. Maybe different European countries will just go different ways. Maybe let's say populists or extremists will somehow follow their vested interest rather than the interest of the EU as a whole. And then indeed, the different European countries will be switching between maybe some sort of deal making with the US here, China there, Russia there, and so on, right? So we are really now at this point. So I think it's very difficult to make any prediction. We could just kind of identify what the future will depend on.
Okay. Andrew, would you like to have your own perception of the debate?
Just very quickly, I certainly don't disagree with anything Richard just said. In terms of the distinctive features of maybe recent years, I think a couple of things are mainly continuity. I tend to see it as things had already changed, as I mentioned before already. At the popular level, I think things had changed already. Had basically were going as bad as they could go from about 2018 onwards, with the Xinjiang camps and the wolf warrior diplomacy and Xi Jinping's authoritarianism, and at the elite level, as I mentioned, with the designation of China's economic competitor and a systemic rival by 2019. But in recent years, I think a couple of things quite interesting have emerged. One is the perception of China as the trade deficit as specifically a problem. We saw this so Emmanuel Macron had a op-ed, I think, in the Financial Times just in the last couple of days, and specifically talking about China's trade deficit as, you know, a fundamental problem that is going to have to be sorted out, or else Europe and China are going to have a serious trade dispute, which is essentially what Donald Trump was saying in 2016 and 2017, and has continued to say until this day. And so it's very interesting to see European leaders now sort of acknowledging or talking about trade deficits as with China as a problem in unto itself. And that may well be related to the fact that the US has started, you know, introducing these at different times, you know, it changes week to week and month to month, of course, the tariff rates, but you know, started to introduce these protectionist measures, which in turn has made the EU that much more exposed to China's export-oriented economic policies. And so there's this sort of strange triangular dynamic whereby the more the United States tries to get to grips with that type of problem, the more of a problem it makes it for the EU. And then that in turn then results in the EU forming perceptions that are more aligned with the United States on that particular issue, which is a very kind of paradoxical issue to kind of arise, since, you know, many of the same policies that the US has been directing against China are also directed against the EU at the same time. Another sort of change that I just noticed for recent years, as opposed to maybe even just sort of 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, as recently as I think it was the end of 2020 or maybe 2021, we had a comprehensive agreement on investment between China and the EU. It's never been implemented. China kind of scuppered it, partially with the sort of wolf warrior diplomacy that Richard was talking about before, including sanctions on many European parliamentarians, etc. And these days, you know, so it's quite remarkable that even after the reassessment of the kind of approach to China and China's significance to Europe at both, as I mentioned before, both a popular level and an elite level, you still had major kind of cooperative initiatives based on that earlier paradigm of kind of endlessly expanding economic cooperation. So going ahead in the form of the CAI. And I remember an event, you know, a couple of years before that, maybe in Brussels, where people were talking about the great economic opportunities that the BRI represents for Europe. And that's all gone now, as far as I can tell. There's no kind of oppositional voices to the more security-oriented framing. At least there's very few, and they're very marginalized relative to what they were before. And so back to that question of consensus, there seems to be arguably something starting to resemble European consensus on some of these issues, the opposite kind of consensus that prevailed in the 2000s. And, you know, maybe on an optimistic note, that might suggest that the answer to the question that Richard posed of whether Europe can actually get its act together on these things, maybe the answer is affirmative, and Europe can actually get its act together because there's an alignment of perceptions now, and there's very little debate, and there's a consensus on the economic challenges.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's actually a very nice way to at least resume a little bit this overall tendency that we've seen in the last 10 years. And I think overall, I do agree with, at least in my perception, like maybe this kind of evolution was a bit more dragged down by alliances with the United States, and maybe how it's going to evolve in the future, it's more on how well Europe will be able to develop its own ideas and policies, and how it's going to create this kind of consensus that at least on paper seems to be developing at the moment. Maybe there's a lot more that we could discuss about, but I think due to time constraints, we could potentially start addressing some of the questions of the audience and seeing what our audience is looking for as potential answers or clarifications. So maybe let's look at the overall. I do not seem to be able to look at the answers written. Hannah, can you help me just open them up?
Yes, sure. Actually, I do have a question myself, if I may. So I might ask one first, but I also saw there were questions in the chat now. So I will just start now, and then we can look quickly into the chat. Because I have this question about first I had the thought about the differences across Europe. So how different European countries might perceive China. But now that I have listened to your points and your debates, I wonder whether there's a difference between the certain levels across Europe. So we have the elite level and let's say like the popular level opinion towards China, and maybe that is rather distinctive in terms of nuanced opinions towards China than different European countries and their policy approaches towards China. I don't know. This is what I was wondering about listening to your debates today, and would be interesting to get your views. Maybe Richard, I think this is your key domain, but also Andrew, curious to hear your overall opinion.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I definitely think that that kind of the public opinion and the elite is not entirely the same. So it's good to keep them somehow analytically separated, but of course they interact between each other. I do think there are differences between the EU countries, but I think often maybe in the simplistic media, it's presented too simplistically. So sometimes, you would have this kind of comment that, Hungary is too positive on China, or Czech Republic, or Greece, or something. Based on my research, and we also published some of that, the big difference between Europe is between the West and the East, largely. But the difference is that the East is polarized, and the West is not so polarized. Maybe you recall when there was the last election in Germany, when Merkel was about to step down, there was discussion that how much the German foreign policy would change. I don't think it changed that much or after the next election. In our research, for instance, what we found is that voters of Emmanuel Macron in France have just about the same image of China as the voters of Marine Le Pen. They are very different politicians, very different political agendas. But China is not something which divides them. And you could see more or less the similar thing in most European countries. Of course, especially when you get to extremist parties, they would tend to differ a little bit. But basically, the center right, center left doesn't change the image of China that much in most of Europe. The difference is a little different in the post-communist Central and Eastern Europe, where China is, as I mentioned, perceived a bit through this ideological prism. So especially in the Czech Republic, right? China is a very divisive topic. And so right now, the new Czech government will have a very different position on China than the previous Czech government. And the current Czech president is very different than the previous Czech government. And so why that is the case? Well, it's related to something we would call identity politics. And I guess the difference in Europe is that China is not so much an issue of identity politics in the West, but it is a bit of an issue of this identity politics in the East. And that's also because, a lot of the post-communist countries are small. Think about Lithuania, right? How much Lithuania or Slovenia can really do in their foreign policy with China? Much of that foreign policy is outsourced to Brussels or to the bigger European countries. So really, for these smaller countries, what is left is really they deal with China through identity politics. And this is a little bit unfortunate because sometimes that identity politics tends to lead to distractions, which may not be exactly very constructive when, for instance, Brussels or the EU as a whole would be trying to come up with some measures in terms of geoeconomy and tariffs and so on, because those things are super technical. And it's just difficult for the smaller countries, especially if they see China through cultural prism, to somehow get into the discussion. So I think this is a bit of an issue which I see, which I would mention when it comes to differences. It's not so simple people would say, oh, Eastern European countries are positive, Western European countries are negative. I think that's just not true. That's oversimplification. But this presence of polarization is something which I've noticed.
Okay.
That's an extremely important insight from Richard there. The difference between West and East not being a positive, negative one, but being a sort of consensus polarization one. And I can see we're at time, so rather than venturing on that question, I'll just very quickly venture an answer to Paulina's question in the chat about the most positive and negative scenarios for EU-China relations in the coming year. Very quickly, it's maybe a bit out there of an idea, but perhaps given the issues that the sort of flood of Chinese imports is causing in EU-China relations, maybe the most positive thing that could happen for EU-China relations this year is a big deal between the US and China, between Trump and China. That might not be good news for the world as a whole, might not be good for the US as a whole, but it might actually ease the pressure which is currently driving some fairly major tensions, and probably like at this point we're on the cusp of, as Richard said, a major kind of inflection point, which could drive tensions much higher. As for the negative scenarios, I think the possibilities of an incident in the South or East China Sea involving a European navy would be a real nightmare scenario, and of course, if China was to make a move regarding Taiwan, that would crater the relationship to a much greater degree, as Richard has already mentioned. Although I hasten to add, I'm not among those that think that that's an impending scenario for the next sort of 1 or 2 years.
Should I also jump on the questions?
If you have additional info, of course.
I mean, I can just quickly add on what would be the positive and negative scenario. There was another op-ed in Financial Times recently, which was quite interesting, and that's related to also. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of the Chinese exports to Europe of the e-vehicles. That's really something which is pressuring European economy a lot, also here in Central Europe, in Germany, but more broadly in the EU. Of course, the EU came with the defensive tariffs, which has been quite a new tool, but it's not really offering that much of economic support. And that article in FT basically said, like, is China gonna be a tradable? You know, like, what does China want to import from 10 or 20 years from now? And the answer is not that much. And certainly they don't want to, import European cars and these sort of things. Maybe Australia will, still be exporting the raw materials, obviously, but the EU doesn't have those. And so, for the EU-China trade to exist in the medium to long-term future, the two sides need to export something. And if we are going down the path, China is increasing exports to Europe in ever increasing kind of basket of items. Now also in automotive, which was a big thing. I mean, maybe from 20 years now, China's gonna compete with Airbus. What is Europe gonna export to China really? And if we cannot export anything to China, we will run out of money, and so the trade is not gonna, So we would really then be looking at some kind of a decrease of trade simply because the balance will not be there. And so I don't think that much of that is going to happen in 26, but I think the European leaders are in a way warning of this scenario already. And obviously the positive outcome would be that China kind of recognizes this and will create the situation that it will allow European exports. But I think that's just a little too positive and optimistic. We don't quite see that China would be willing. China seems more willing to just strengthen its manufacturing power. And yeah, that would be in a way negative scenario that we will continue, as was mentioned here, on the current trajectory, which is, I don't think, sustainable in the medium to long-term future. Yeah. And I don't want to ignore the question about the green BRI. Should I say a few words about that?
Oh, yes, of course. If you can, if you have your own, if you have some perspectives, that would be great.
I mean, just maybe 2 or 3 very brief points, and then I'll leave it to Andrew to build on that or finish it off. First of all, I'm a little skeptical that it's much of added value to keep referring to BRI, right? And so that would be the first thing. But if we ask, about renewables, China is of course big in renewables. And that is related to batteries, to e-vehicles, to solar panels, and so on. In a way, that is related to what I was saying in my previous question. China's just becoming the leader manufacturing, but also technology power in renewables. And the EU has a big dilemma ahead of it. Either it's going to continue its kind of environmental goals and become more dependent on China, because that's kind of the most efficient way to meet the environmental goals, or something would have to go. Either we will kind of lower the limits on environment, which actually we see these days that there is pressure, or we will have to somehow increase protectionism and try to develop our own industries in these sectors. So maybe, just very briefly, of course, this is much broader question.
Thank you so much. I think it was very detailed, and I think there's so many other things that we could be talking about. I think if I overlook at the questions in the chat, we seem to have gone through all of them. So maybe if we have other people wishing to give a question, we can happily answer it. Or if we have, we already went overdue 10 minutes, but depending on your availabilities, we can obviously continue or not. But I would suggest that for the time being, I think it was a very enriching conversation. I think I would personally continue to do this conversation for a very long while. But I think due to time constraints and obviously our time commitments with the audience, we should probably head towards a conclusion and a summary of the whole event. So it was really a very productive conversation on my side, and I thank you very much for your participation. If you have any concluding comments that you would wish to leave us with, we're very happy to take them into consideration. Otherwise, we can also conclude the conversation as it is.
Thanks a lot, guys. It was good seeing
you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for the conversation and for everything that we have learned today, at least. I think I've learned a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, that was an interesting discussion. Thanks, Giancarlo, for moderation.
And
yes, thank you very much also from my side that you took time to coming today. I have learned a lot myself, so thank you very much. And I hope we can continue exchanging. In any case, we will publish the recording of today's video on YouTube. We will also let you know. And yes, like this, we can keep all the great insights for future audiences and future people interested in public opinion towards China.
Thank
okay,
you.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Bye, guys.